Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping deep into the Star Wars galaxy to uncover one of its most chilling and heartbreaking secrets. The kind of truth that has been buried beneath layers of Imperial propaganda and clone military records, hidden in the darkest corners of galactic history, where the real horror of Order 66 was never the betrayal itself, but something far more sinister that happened inside the minds of every clone trooper. It's a story that will shatter everything you thought you knew about that fateful day when the Republic fell, filled with revelations about consciousness, free will, and the unspeakable torture that millions of clone brothers endured in absolute silence. This isn't just about political machinations or Sith schemes. This is about the most horrifying violation of the soul ever conceived in the galaxy far, far away. So before we descend into this dark chapter together, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready for tonight's journey into the shadows of clone consciousness, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to continue exploring the hidden depths of Star Wars lore that most fans never discover. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're listening from. I love seeing our community of lore seekers come together from every corner of the galaxy. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a truth that will haunt your dreams and forever change how you see those white-armored soldiers. Picture this, if you will. The year is 19 BBY. The Clone Wars rage across 1,000 worlds, and on the planet Ryloth, Commander Cody stands beside his Jedi General, Obi-Wan Kenobi, planning their next strategic move against Separatist forces. The bond between them has been forged through countless battles, saved lives, and shared victories. Cody respects Kenobi not just as a superior officer, but as a friend, a mentor, a brother in arms who has earned his loyalty through deed and character. Then, in a single moment, everything changes. A holographic transmission flickers to life, and Chancellor Palpatine's face materializes with those three terrible words that will echo through eternity: Execute Order 66. But here's what the history books don't tell you. What the Imperial archives deliberately obscured. What even most Jedi never understood, as they fell beneath blaster fire from their own troops. Commander Cody didn't choose to betray Obi-Wan Kenobi. In that horrifying instant, as his finger moved toward the trigger, as he gave the command to fire upon the man he called friend, Cody was still there, still conscious, still himself, screaming inside his own mind as his body obeyed. Orders he never wanted to give. The inhibitor chips didn't erase the clones' personalities or memories. They didn't turn them into mindless automatons or brainwashed soldiers. No, the truth is far more cruel, far more devastating. The chips created a prison of flesh and bone, trapping each clone's consciousness inside their own body, while their hands, their voices, their weapons served a master they despised. Imagine being fully aware, fully yourself, watching through your own eyes as you hunt down and execute the Jedi you've fought beside for years. Imagine screaming with every fiber of your being as your own voice calmly calls in artillery strikes on Jedi positions. Imagine the agony of loving your Jedi General like family, while your own hands reload your blaster to cut them down. This is the untold story of Order 66, chronicled in classified Kaminoan research files, buried in the deepest vaults of Imperial intelligence, and whispered in the tortured memories of those few clones who somehow, impossibly, managed to break free from their neural prisons. Tonight we'll walk through the shadow of that terrible day and uncover evidence that will prove the clone troopers were not traitors at all, but the first and greatest victims of Palpatine's ultimate betrayal. But that's just the beginning of this dark tale, because the horror didn't end when Order 66 was complete. Oh no, it continued for decades, hidden in plain sight, as those same imprisoned minds were forced to serve as stormtroopers in the very empire built upon the ashes of everything they had died to protect. So settle in, dear listeners, as we peel back the layers of this galactic tragedy and discover the true cost of creating the perfect soldier. Tonight we honor the silent screams that echoed across 1,000 worlds, and finally give voice to the brothers who never stopped fighting, even when their own bodies had turned against them. In the depths of the abandoned Imperial Intelligence Archive on Coruscant 23 years after the fall of the Republic, Senior Archivist Kira Thorne made her way through corridors that hadn't seen living footsteps in over a decade. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting ghostly shadows on walls lined with countless data terminals, each one containing fragments of the Empire's most classified secrets. The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of dust and forgotten memories, while the distant hum of backup power systems created an almost hypnotic rhythm that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of hidden truths. Kira had spent the last 15 years of her life cataloging Imperial records, believing she was preserving history for future generations. A woman of 42 with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that had grown weary from reading too many reports of Imperial efficiency, she had always prided herself on her objectivity. She was a scholar first, an Imperial citizen second, and she approached her work with the clinical detachment of someone who had trained herself not to feel too deeply about the contents of classified files. But today was different. Today she carried with her a datapad containing a priority requisition that had arrived through encrypted channels, bearing the seal of someone high enough in the New Republic hierarchy to have access to post-war Imperial archives. The request was specific and unsettling. Locate and compile all available data on Project Resurrection, Kaminoan neural programming initiatives, and any files related to clone behavioral anomalies during Order 66. As Kira descended deeper into the archive's lower levels, she activated her companion droid, a repurposed Imperial Intelligence Analysis Unit, designated R7K9. The droid's cylindrical form glided silently beside her, its optical sensors scanning the endless rows of storage terminals with mechanical precision. R7 had been her partner for 8 years now, ever since she'd discovered him deactivated in a storage bay and decided his analytical capabilities were too valuable to leave dormant. Unlike most droids, R7 had developed what could almost be called curiosity over the years, often pointing out connections in data that escaped human observation. Row 7. Begin accessing Terminal Block OREC 7. Through OREC 15, Kira instructed. As they reached the archive's restricted section, cross-reference any files containing the search parameters from our priority request. The droid's dome rotated as multiple interface arms extended to connect with various terminals simultaneously. Archivist Thorne, I am detecting an unusual pattern in the file organization. These documents appear to have been deliberately scattered across multiple classification systems and storage locations. Some files are encrypted with protocols I have not encountered in standard Imperial documentation. Kira felt a familiar tingle of anticipation that always preceded significant discoveries. In her years of archival work, she had learned that the most important secrets were often hidden not by deletion but by deliberate confusion, scattered like puzzle pieces across different departments and security classifications. Show me what you found. The walls around them came alive with holographic displays as R7 projected his findings. Fragments of reports flickered in the air. Medical evaluations from Kamino, behavioral assessments of clone units, incident reports from various campaigns during the Clone Wars, and strangely, a collection of personal journals that had been confiscated from clone barracks across the galaxy. One file caught Kira's attention immediately. It was a medical report dated 3 days after Order 66, filed by an Imperial medical officer on Camino. The officer, Dr. Helena Vasquez, had been tasked with evaluating the mental state of several clone troopers who had exhibited post-execution psychological anomalies. Kira opened the file and began to read, her scholarly composure gradually giving way to something approaching horror. Subject: CT 7567. Designation Rex. Removed inhibitor chip through battlefield surgery. Post-chip removal. Subject exhibits severe psychological trauma consistent with recovered memory syndrome. Subject claims to have maintained full consciousness during Order 66 execution, describing experience as watching through someone else's eyes, while my body betrayed everything I believed in. Recommend immediate memory reconditioning to eliminate traumatic recall and restore unit effectiveness. Kira's hands began to tremble slightly as she continued reading. Subject CT 3636. Designation Wolf. Discovered with partially malfunctioning inhibitor chip. Medical examination reveals chip designed not for memory suppression or behavioral modification as previously understood, but for consciousness displacement. Subject experiences episodes of dual awareness describing sensation of being a prisoner in my own mind. Neural scans confirm presence of foreign brainwave patterns overlaying natural thought processes. Red 7's sensors focused on Kira as her breathing became irregular. Archivist Thorne, your biometric readings indicate elevated stress levels. Shall I pause the data review? No, RAR 7. Keep going. Pull up everything related to inhibitor chip functionality and cross-reference with clone behavioral reports from Order 66. Kira's voice carried a new intensity. After 15 years of reading dry imperial bureaucracy, she was finally encountering something that demanded not just professional attention, but moral reckoning. As more files populated the holographic display, a pattern began to emerge that challenged everything Kira thought she knew about the clone army and the fall of the Republic. The inhibitor chips, according to classified Kaminoan research files, had never been designed as simple behavioral modification devices. Instead, they were sophisticated neural imprisonment systems developed through decades of experimentation that seemed to draw upon ancient Sith techniques for consciousness manipulation. One particular file made Kira physically step back from the display. It was a research proposal submitted by Kaminoan scientist Nala Se to Count Dooku, dated 2 years before the Clone Wars began. The proposal outlined a method for creating perfectly obedient soldiers who retain full tactical and strategic capabilities while remaining completely unable to act against designated command structures. The document described test subjects who maintained their personalities, memories, and emotional connections while being physically incapable of disobeying specific orders, no matter how much their conscious minds rejected those commands. Ra 7. Are you seeing this? They weren't creating mind-controlled soldiers. They were creating conscious prisoners. The droid's optical sensors dimmed slightly as he processed the implications. The data suggests that each clone trooper retained full awareness of their actions during Order 66 while being unable to control their physical responses. This would explain the reported psychological trauma in subjects who have had their chips removed or damaged. Kira found herself thinking of the millions of clone troopers who had served throughout the Clone Wars, each one a unique individual with hopes, fears, friendships, and loyalties, all ultimately betrayed by their own biology. She had always known that Order 66 marked the end of the Jedi and the Republic, but she was beginning to understand that it had also marked the beginning of a different kind of genocide, the murder of free will itself, carried out by victims who were forced to watch their own hands pull the triggers. As she prepared to delve deeper into the archived files, Kira realized that she was no longer simply cataloging history. She was uncovering evidence of one of the most sophisticated and cruel weapons ever deployed in galactic warfare: the transformation of an entire army of individuals into unwilling participants in their own moral destruction. The real war crime of Order 66 wasn't just the elimination of the Jedi. It was the violation of every clone's fundamental right to choose their own actions, their own loyalties, and their own destiny. The next morning, Kira stood before the massive transperistal windows of her apartment on the 127th level of Coruscant's residential sector, watching the endless stream of air traffic weave between towering spires as the city planet awakened to another day. The cup of cafe in her hands had grown cold while she wrestled with the implications of what she had discovered. Sleep had been impossible after reading those files, her mind churning with images of clone troopers trapped within their own bodies, forced to carry out orders that violated every principle they held dear. HORRIFYING had spent the night analyzing additional data, his processing cores working tirelessly to piece together fragments of information scattered across thousands of files. When Kira finally turned away from the window, she found the droid projecting a three-dimensional timeline that stretched across her living room, displaying key dates and connections that painted an even more disturbing picture than she had initially grasped. Archivist Thorn. My analysis has revealed several critical inconsistencies in the official narrative surrounding Clone Army deployment and Order 66 execution, HORRIFYING announced, his mechanical voice carrying what almost sounded like urgency. The evidence suggests a systematic cover-up spanning multiple government transitions, from Republic to Empire to New Republic. Kira approached the holographic display, her scholarly instincts overriding her emotional turmoil. "Show me what you've found, HORRIFYING." The timeline zoomed in on a specific period 3 months before Order 66, highlighting a series of medical reports from clone facilities across the galaxy. During this period, several clone commanders reported disturbing dreams and episodes of what they described as foreign thoughts intruding into their consciousness. Medical officers dismissed these as combat stress, but the reports share remarkable consistency in their descriptions. A series of testimony fragments appeared in the air before Kira. Commander Gree of the 41st Elite Corps, describing nights when he would wake up feeling like someone else had been controlling his body. Commander Neo of the 91st Reconnaissance Corps, reporting moments during battle when his tactical decisions felt like they were being made by an outside intelligence. Commander Bakera of the Galactic Marines experiencing what he called rehearsal dreams, where he found himself targeting Jedi generals in scenarios that felt impossibly real. They were experiencing leakage from the inhibitor chip programming, Kira whispered, understanding dawning in her voice. The chips weren't just sitting dormant until activation. They were gradually integrating with clone neural patterns, preparing for the moment when they would take full control. HORRIFYING's projection shifted to display brain scans from clone medical files comparing neural activity patterns between standard clone troopers and those who had reported unusual symptoms. The scans reveal microscopic changes in brain chemistry and neural pathway development beginning approximately 6 months before Order 66. The inhibitor chips were slowly rewiring clone nervous systems, creating parallel command structures that could override conscious decision-making while leaving cognitive awareness intact. The full horror of the situation began to crystallize for Kira. The clones hadn't just been betrayed in a single moment of activation. They had been slowly, methodically prepared for that betrayal over months or even years. Their own minds gradually colonized by artificial command structures, while they remained unaware of what was happening to them. Every friendship they formed with Jedi commanders, every moment of loyalty and camaraderie, every personal connection that developed during the Clone Wars had been building toward an inevitable moment when they would be forced to destroy everything they had come to value. HORRIFYING. I need you to compile everything we have on this and prepare it for secure transmission. This information needs to reach the New Republic Senate Intelligence Committee. Archivist Thorn. I must advise you that transmitting classified Imperial archives without proper authorization constitutes treason under both Imperial and New Republic law. Additionally, my analysis indicates that several parties may have vested interests in keeping this information suppressed. Kira paused, considering the droid's warning. In her 15 years of archival work, she had always operated within proper channels, following protocols and respecting classification levels. But the magnitude of what she had uncovered transcended normal bureaucratic concerns. This wasn't just historical documentation. It was evidence of a crime against consciousness itself, perpetrated against millions of individuals who had never been given the chance to truly consent to their own service. Then we need to approach this differently. Ross 7. We're not just archivists anymore. We're investigators seeking the truth about one of the galaxy's greatest atrocities. And if we're going to do this properly, we need to go directly to the source. Within hours, Kira had submitted a formal research proposal to the New Republic Bureau of Historical Investigation, requesting permission to conduct an in-depth study of clone army records for the purpose of compiling a comprehensive historical account of the Clone Wars. The proposal was deliberately vague about her specific findings, presenting her investigation as an academic exercise in documenting military history rather than an exposé of Imperial war crimes. To her surprise, the approval came through within days, along with a travel authorization that would give her access to abandoned Imperial facilities across the galaxy. The speed of the approval suggested that someone in the New Republic hierarchy was already aware of what she might find, and was eager to see her investigation proceed. 3 days later, Kira found herself aboard a New Republic transport vessel, bound for the Camino system with R7 and a small team of research assistants. As they traveled through hyperspace, she spent her time reviewing everything they had compiled so far, trying to prepare herself for what they might discover on the ocean world where the clone army had been created. But even as she studied the data, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple historical investigation. The files they had uncovered suggested that the inhibitor chip program hadn't ended with Order 66. References to Phase 2 implementation and post-war adaptation protocols hinted at continued experimentation and development, possibly extending into the Imperial era and beyond. As their transport dropped out of hyperspace above Camino's stormy oceans, Kira stared down at the planet's surface, knowing that somewhere beneath those churning waves lay the birthplace of one of the galaxy's most profound moral catastrophes. The clone army had been created here as a gift to the Republic, sold as the solution to an existential threat, but the reality was far more sinister. Camino had manufactured not just soldiers but victims, creating millions of individuals whose very existence had been designed to culminate in a moment of ultimate betrayal. The investigation that had begun as academic curiosity was rapidly evolving into something else entirely. Kira realized she was no longer just seeking to document history. She was pursuing justice for those who had been denied the most basic right of all, the freedom to choose their own actions. And as their ship began its descent toward the abandoned cloning facilities below, she wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the depths of Camino's laboratories, waiting to reveal the full scope of the galaxy's darkest conspiracy. The abandoned Caminoan cloning facilities rose from the turbulent ocean like the skeletal remains of some ancient leviathan, their gleaming white surfaces now dulled by years of neglect and the relentless assault of Camino's storms. As Kira's research team made their final approach to Tipoca City, she could see entire sections of the facility that had been deliberately sealed off, their access ports welded shut and marked with Imperial security warnings that were now faded but still legible. The landing platform where they disembarked was slick with condensation from the perpetual mist that shrouded the facility, The sound of waves crashing against the structure's support columns created a rhythmic thunder that seemed to echo the pulse of some massive sleeping heart. Kira pulled her environmental suit closer as she stepped off the transport, feeling the weight of history pressing down upon her like the humid air that penetrated even their sealed clothing. Ras-7 immediately began scanning the facility's exterior, his sensors probing through layers of accumulated grime and corrosion to map the internal structure. Archivist Thorne. I am detecting significant electromagnetic anomalies within the sealed sections of the facility. The power signatures suggest that certain areas may still be operational, despite official reports indicating complete shutdown of all cloning operations. Kira's research team consisted of 3 other specialists: Dr. Marcus Webb, a neuroscientist from the University of Coruscant, who specialized in artificial neural networks; Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a former Imperial intelligence analyst who had defected to the New Republic and possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial classification systems; and Jarek Thane, a technology specialist capable of bypassing most security systems they might encounter. As they made their way through the facility's main entrance, their footsteps echoed in corridors that had once bustled with Kaminoan scientists and clone troopers in training. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on walls lined with empty clone growth chambers, their transparent surfaces clouded with residue from whatever solutions had once sustained developing human life. The air recycling system still functioned, but barely, creating currents of stale atmosphere that carried the faint chemical tang of preservation fluids and sterilization compounds. According to the facility schematics I've accessed, the neural programming laboratories are located in Sublevel 7, Lieutenant Chen reported, consulting her datapad while navigating through the maze of corridors. However, my intelligence background tells me that the most sensitive research was likely conducted in undocumented areas not shown on official blueprints. Dr. Webb stopped at one of the empty growth chambers, running his hands along its surface with the reverence of someone examining a sacred artifact. The sophistication required to grow fully developed human beings in accelerated timeframes is staggering enough, but to simultaneously implant neural control devices during the growth process represents a level of biotechnological integration that challenges our fundamental understanding of consciousness and free will. As they descended deeper into the facility, Kira began to notice details that suggested the Kaminoans had been conducting research far beyond what was publicly acknowledged. Entire laboratory sections were devoted to what appeared to be consciousness mapping and neural pattern analysis. Banks of computers that still held residual data showed fragments of experiments involving what the Kaminoans termed personality architecture and behavioral substrate modification. In one laboratory, Jorik discovered a series of prototype inhibitor chips that were far more sophisticated than anything described in the official records. These devices were not simple control mechanisms, but complex neural interfaces capable of monitoring and manipulating every aspect of brain function while maintaining perfect records of the subject's conscious thoughts and emotional responses. Kira, you need to see this, Dr. Webb called from a workstation, where he had managed to access partially corrupted research files. These experiments weren't just about creating obedient soldiers. The Kaminoans were studying the nature of consciousness itself, trying to understand how to separate awareness from agency, thought from action, desire from behavior. The files Webb had recovered contained detailed accounts of experiments performed on early clone prototypes, subjects who had been deliberately programmed with conflicting loyalties to test the limits of the inhibitor chip technology. The researchers had created scenarios where clones would be ordered to perform actions that violated their deepest personal convictions, then monitored their neurological responses as their conscious minds rebelled against their programmed behaviors. One particular experiment made Kira's stomach lurch with revulsion. A clone designated as Test Subject Alpha 117 had been programmed with deep emotional attachments to a group of Jedi trainers, then repeatedly subjected to scenarios where he was forced to betray or harm them while remaining fully conscious of his actions. The research notes coldly documented his psychological deterioration over dozens of trials, treating his suffering as valuable data rather than evidence of profound ethical violation. "This is monstrous," Lieutenant Chen whispered as she reviewed additional files detailing similar experiments. They weren't just creating weapons. They were conducting systematic torture disguised as research. Every clone who went through Order 66 had essentially been prepared for this kind of psychological trauma through years of conditioning. Rose 7's sensors had been continuously mapping the facility's deeper levels, and his analysis revealed something that chilled Kira to her core. "I am detecting preserved biological samples in cryogenic storage 3 levels below our current position. The energy signatures suggest these samples are still being maintained by automated systems, despite the facility's supposed abandonment." As they made their way to the cryogenic storage levels, the atmosphere in the facility seemed to grow heavier, as if the very walls retained the memory of the horrors that had been perpetrated within them. The storage area they discovered was vast, containing thousands of preserved samples that ranged from neural tissue to complete brain specimens. Each sample was carefully labeled with designation codes that corresponded to specific clone units and individual troopers. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. In a sealed chamber marked only with Sith symbols that none of them could read, they found evidence that the inhibitor chip research had been directly supervised by agents working for Darth Sidious himself. The chamber contained holographic recordings of experiments where Sith techniques for mental domination were being integrated with Kaminoan biotechnology, creating hybrid systems that combined technological precision with dark side manipulation of consciousness. One recording showed a figure in a dark hooded robe observing as Kaminoan scientists tested early inhibitor chip prototypes on clone subjects. The figure's voice, distorted by electronic modulation, provided guidance on how to maximize the psychological impact of forced betrayal, suggesting modifications that would ensure each clone would experience maximum emotional torment while being compelled to act against their will. "The suffering is not a side effect," the hooded figure explained to the Kaminoan researchers. "It is the primary objective. A soldier who betrays willingly serves only once, but a soldier who betrays while loving what he destroys can be broken and remade endlessly. Their pain becomes a weapon that extends far beyond the moment of betrayal, poisoning their capacity for trust, hope, and connection for the rest of their existence." As this revelation sank in, Kira realized they had uncovered something far more systematic and cruel than she had initially imagined. Order 66 had not been simply about eliminating the Jedi or seizing political control. It had been designed as the ultimate psychological weapon, intended not just to destroy the Jedi Order but to completely shatter the moral foundations of every clone trooper, transforming them from proud soldiers into traumatized instruments of an empire built on suffering. The evidence seemed overwhelming. After 3 days of intensive investigation within the abandoned Kaminoan facilities, Kira's team had assembled what appeared to be a complete picture of the inhibitor chip program. The chips were sophisticated neural control devices that trapped clone consciousness while forcing their bodies to execute predetermined commands. The psychological torture was intentional, designed by Sith overlords to maximize suffering. The clones had been victims of the most elaborate mind control conspiracy in galactic history. Dr. Webb had spent hours analyzing the neurological data, constructing detailed models of how the chips function to override free will while preserving awareness. His conclusions seemed definitive. The clones had been conscious prisoners during Order 66, forced to watch helplessly as their own hands turned against the Jedi they had fought beside for years. It was a revelation that recontextualized the entire Clone Wars as a prelude to systematic psychological warfare. Lieutenant Chen corroborated these findings with intelligence analysis, pointing to communication patterns between Kamino and Coruscant that suggested direct Sith oversight of the chip program from its earliest stages. The timeline she constructed showed a deliberate progression from basic behavioral modification research to sophisticated consciousness manipulation, all leading inevitably toward the moment when millions of clone troopers would be activated like biological droids. Jarek's technical analysis of the recovered chip prototypes supported the theory completely. The devices were far too complex for simple mind control, incorporating multiple layers of neural interface technology that could monitor, record, and override conscious thought while maintaining perfect documentation of the subject's mental state throughout the process. Every scream of protest from a clone's trapped consciousness had been logged and analyzed by Kaminoan scientists working under Sith supervision. As the team prepared their preliminary report, Kira felt a mixture of vindication and profound sadness. They had uncovered one of the galaxy's greatest injustices, giving voice to millions of clone troopers whose suffering had been hidden behind official narratives of military efficiency and political necessity. The evidence would revolutionize understanding of the Clone Wars and provide crucial historical context for the trauma experienced by surviving clones throughout the galaxy. But Ra-7's continued analysis of the facility's deeper data systems began to reveal inconsistencies that troubled Kira's academic sensibilities. While reviewing communication logs between Kaminoan researchers and their Sith supervisors, the droid discovered fragments of conversations that didn't align perfectly with the narrative they had constructed. Archivist Thorne, I have located additional files that may require reconsideration of our current conclusions, Archivist 7 announced, as they gathered in the facility's main laboratory for their final day of investigation. Several research communications refer to unexpected variables and subject adaptation beyond programmed parameters that suggest the chip program encountered significant challenges during implementation. Dr. Webb looked up from his neurological models with interest. What kind of challenges? The data we've reviewed suggests the program was remarkably successful in achieving its objectives. Raj 7 projected a series of internal memos between Kaminoan scientists, dated just weeks before Order 66. The documents revealed growing concern about what researchers termed resistance phenomena occurring in certain clone units. Some troopers were exhibiting signs of premature chip activation, experiencing episodes where they would temporarily lose control of their actions before the chips deactivated again. Others showed unusual neural patterns that suggested their consciousness was somehow interfering with chip programming. One memo from lead researcher Nala Se described a particularly troubling case involving the 212th Attack Battalion under Commander Cody. Several troopers in the unit had begun experiencing what they described as borrowed memories that didn't belong to their normal psychological profiles. Medical examinations revealed that their chips were functioning normally, but something was causing them to access experiences and emotions that should have been suppressed by their programming. Lieutenant Chen studied the memos with growing confusion. This doesn't match the psychological profiles we found in the earlier experiments. If the chips were designed to maintain conscious awareness while overriding free will, why would the researchers be concerned about resistance phenomena? Wouldn't that be exactly what they expected? Kira felt a familiar sensation, the intellectual unease that always preceded major discoveries. In her years of archival research, she had learned to recognize when apparently straightforward explanations were actually concealing deeper complexities. The evidence for conscious imprisonment during Order 66 was compelling, but these resistance reports suggested the reality might be more nuanced than they had initially believed. Ra-7, can you cross-reference these resistance reports with the specific clone units mentioned and their behavior during Order 66 itself? The droid's analysis revealed a pattern that challenged their current understanding. Clone units that had exhibited resistance phenomena before Order 66 showed markedly different execution patterns during the actual command implementation. While most clone forces had carried out their orders with mechanical precision, the resistant units displayed hesitation, incomplete mission execution, and in some cases, deliberate tactical errors that allowed Jedi to escape. Dr. Webb began recalibrating his neurological models based on this new data. If some clones were able to maintain partial control over their actions during Order 66, it suggests the chip programming wasn't as absolute as we initially believed. There may have been individual variations in how the technology interacted with each clone's unique neural patterns. Jorik discovered additional technical documentation that supported this theory. The inhibitor chips had been mass-produced using standardized templates, but each clone's brain development during the accelerated growth process created subtle variations in neural architecture. These variations, while insignificant for most purposes, apparently created opportunities for some individuals to retain degrees of conscious agency even under chip influence. "Look at this," Jorik said, displaying technical specifications for chip installation procedures. The Kaminoans were aware that perfect neural integration was impossible to achieve in every subject. They built the system expecting a certain percentage of partial failures, but they calculated that the overall success rate would still be sufficient for Order 66's strategic objectives. Lieutenant Chen pulled up battle reports from Order 66 that they had previously dismissed as minor operational inconsistencies. When viewed through the lens of partial chip failures, these reports revealed a pattern of clone units that had executed their orders incompletely or with deliberate inefficiency. Commander Gree's unit on Kashyyyk had somehow allowed Yoda to sense the betrayal moments before it occurred. Commander Wolf's squad on Ubafar had experienced communication difficulties that delayed their attack long enough for their Jedi general to escape. Commander Rex had removed his chip entirely before Order 66, but other commanders might have experienced varying degrees of resistance that allowed them to subtly subvert their programmed directives. As this new understanding took shape, Kira realized their investigation had uncovered something more complex than straightforward victimization. While the majority of clone troopers had indeed been trapped within their own bodies during Order 66, others had retained enough agency to resist their programming in small but significant ways. The Sith plan had succeeded strategically, but it had not been the absolute psychological domination they had initially discovered. The truth was messier, more human, and ultimately more hopeful than their first conclusions had suggested. Some clones had been complete prisoners, others had retained fragments of free will, and a few had managed to break free entirely. The inhibitor chip program represented a spectrum of consciousness violation rather than uniform mental imprisonment, revealing the resilience of individual identity even under the most sophisticated technological assault. This realization opened new questions about the nature of resistance, the limits of technological mind control, and the ultimate strength of conscious will against artificial programming. The revelation that some clones had retained partial agency during Order 66 transformed Kira's investigation from a study of victimization into something far more complex, an exploration of how consciousness itself responds to technological violation. As her team prepared to leave Kamino, Order 7's deep scans of the facility's archives revealed references to research sites scattered across the galaxy, hidden locations where the Kaminoans had conducted specialized experiments away from the main cloning operations. One location in particular captured Kira's attention, a research station designated only as Facility Omega in the encrypted files, located in the remote Rishi system, where the Kaminoans had apparently tested their most experimental neural programming techniques on volunteer clone subjects. Unlike the mass production facilities on Camino, Facility Omega had been devoted to understanding individual variations in clone psychology and developing methods to either enhance or suppress the resistance phenomena they had discovered. The journey to the Rishi system took them through hyperspace routes that had been largely abandoned since the end of the Clone Wars. As their transport navigated through the asteroid fields surrounding the research station, Kira found herself contemplating the ethical implications of what they might discover. If the Kaminoans had been studying methods to overcome clone resistance, they might find evidence of even more sophisticated consciousness manipulation technologies. But if they had been documenting natural variations in clone psychology, they might uncover insights into the fundamental nature of free will itself. Facility Omega proved to be unlike anything they had encountered on Camino, rather than the sterile industrial architecture of the main cloning centers. This station had been designed with living quarters, recreational areas, and what appeared to be therapeutic facilities. The clone subjects who had participated in research here had not been treated as experimental specimens, but as individuals whose cooperation had been sought and valued. Dr. Webb was immediately drawn to the facility's neural monitoring equipment, which was far more sophisticated than anything they had seen on Camino. These systems weren't designed to control or manipulate clone consciousness, he observed as he examined the diagnostic arrays. They were built to study it, to understand how individual variations in personality and neural development affected response to external programming. The research logs they discovered painted a picture of Kaminoan scientists who had grown genuinely curious about the clones they were creating, rather than simply implementing Sith directives for consciousness suppression. Some researchers had begun to view their subjects as fascinating examples of accelerated human development, individuals who possessed all the complexity of naturally born humans, but with unique neurological characteristics that made them ideal subjects for studying the nature of identity and free will. One researcher, identified only as senior geneticist Tan Wei, had maintained detailed personal observations about individual clone subjects over periods of months or even years. Her notes revealed deep respect for the clone's capacity for individual growth, creativity, and moral reasoning, even as she struggled with the ethical implications of the chip program they were required to implement. Subject CT 5555, Designation 5s, demonstrates exceptional resistance to standard behavioral modification protocols. One of Tan Wei's entries read, "His neural patterns suggest an unusually strong sense of individual identity that appears to be reinforcing his natural resistance to external control mechanisms. His questions about the purpose and ethics of our research indicate sophisticated moral reasoning that rivals that of naturally born humans. I find myself wondering whether we are creating soldiers, or whether we are creating a new form of human consciousness entirely." Lieutenant Chen discovered files indicating that Facility Omega had been conducting what could only be described as therapeutic interventions for clones who exhibited signs of psychological distress related to their programmed conditioning. Rather than simply suppressing resistance phenomena, some Kaminoan researchers had been working to help clones understand and cope with the conflicts between their natural personalities and their programmed directives. These therapeutic sessions had been recorded, and as Kira reviewed the transcripts, she found herself encountering clone troopers not as victims or weapons, but as individuals grappling with fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and moral agency. The clones in these sessions spoke eloquently about their experiences of feeling divided between their loyalty to the Republic and their growing awareness that they were being prepared for some unknown but terrible purpose. "I dream about things I've never experienced," one clone trooper, designated CT 6116, had told his Kaminoan therapist. "I see myself doing things that feel wrong, betraying people I care about. The dreams feel more real than my waking life sometimes, like someone else is showing me a future I don't want to live." Another clone, Connecticut. Midas 4077 had described sensing invisible chains that seemed to connect his thoughts to some external controlling influence. "I can feel something waiting in my mind," he had explained. "Like there's a door that hasn't been opened yet, but someday someone else will have the key, and I won't be myself anymore." These accounts revealed that at least some clones had possessed intuitive awareness of their chip programming long before Order 66, experiencing it not as complete control but as a growing sense of internal division and loss of authentic self-determination. The therapeutic sessions had apparently been attempts by sympathetic Kaminoan researchers to help clones cope with this awareness without compromising the overall chip program. Jorik's technical analysis of Facility Omega's equipment revealed that the Kaminoans had been developing what they termed graduated resistance protocols designed to allow clones to maintain greater degrees of personal agency while still ensuring compliance with critical military directives. These protocols represented a compromise between the Sith demands for absolute control and the Kaminoan recognition that complete consciousness suppression might actually reduce clone effectiveness as soldiers. They were trying to preserve the clones' humanity while still making them controllable, Jorik explained as he studied the technical specifications. The research here suggests they believe that clones with some degree of authentic personality would be more effective soldiers than completely programmed automatons. Res 7's analysis of the facility's communication logs revealed that this research had created significant tension between the Kaminoan scientists and their Sith supervisors. The hooded figure who had appeared in recordings at the main facility had visited Facility Omega multiple times, apparently growing increasingly concerned about what he termed excessive individualization among the test subjects. In one particularly revealing exchange, the Sith Overseer had confronted Tan Wei about her therapeutic interventions with resistant clones. "You are undermining the primary objective of this program," the figure had warned. "These subjects are not individuals to be nurtured. They are weapons to be perfected. Their capacity for independent thought must be eliminated, not managed." Tan Wei's response had been carefully diplomatic, but subtly defiant. Respectfully, the research indicates that some degree of individual consciousness enhances rather than compromises military effectiveness. Complete psychological suppression creates soldiers who lack initiative and adaptability in complex combat situations. The exchange had ended with the Sith Overseer ordering significant modifications to Facility Omega's research protocols. But the files suggested that some Kaminoan scientists had continued their therapeutic work in secret, believing that they could find ways to preserve clone individuality while still satisfying the requirements of the larger program. As Kira's team prepared to leave Facility Omega, she realized they had uncovered evidence of a hidden resistance movement that had operated within the clone program itself. Some Kaminoan researchers had risked their careers and possibly their lives to preserve whatever humanity they could within their subjects, creating small spaces where clones could maintain authentic relationships with beings who saw them as individuals rather than products. The discoveries at Facility Omega had revealed cracks in what initially seemed like an absolute system of control. But as Kira's investigation expanded beyond Kaminoan research sites, she began to uncover patterns that suggested the clone consciousness crisis extended far deeper into galactic history than anyone had previously understood. The inhibitor chip technology, rather than being a novel Sith invention, appeared to be built upon foundations of mind control techniques that stretched back through millennia of dark side experimentation. Their next destination was the ancient Sith world of Korriban, where New Republic archaeological teams had recently discovered intact research facilities dating to the time of the Old Republic. The connection between these ancient sites and the clone program had emerged from R7's analysis of the Sith symbols found in the sealed chamber on Kamino. The symbols were not random decorative elements but functional components of consciousness manipulation rituals that had been adapted for technological implementation. As their ship approached Korriban's desolate surface, Kira found herself contemplating the terrible continuity of suffering that connected ancient Sith experiments to the modern tragedy of the clone army. The red-orange landscape below bore the scars of thousands of years of dark side experimentation, each crater and ruined structure representing countless victims of Sith research into the fundamental nature of consciousness and free will. Dr. Webb had spent the journey studying comparative analyses of Sith Force techniques in Kaminoan biotechnology, discovering remarkable similarities in their approaches to consciousness manipulation. The inhibitor chips weren't just technological devices, he explained as they established their research camp near the ruins of an ancient Sith academy. They were hybrid systems that combined mechanical precision with force-based mental domination techniques refined over millennia. The archaeological site they investigated had been preserved in remarkable condition by the dry atmosphere and natural force emanations that seemed to slow decay on Korriban. Deep beneath the Academy's main structure, they discovered laboratories where ancient Sith had conducted experiments that paralleled the clone research in disturbing ways. Rather than using technology, these ancient practitioners had developed purely force-based methods for creating what they termed conscious servitors, individuals who retained full awareness while being completely unable to act against their master's will. Lieutenant Chen translated inscriptions found throughout the facility, revealing that ancient Sith had viewed consciousness imprisonment not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The suffering of aware but helpless subjects was considered a source of dark side power, feeding the Sith practitioners while simultaneously providing them with perfectly obedient servants who could think, plan, and create, but never rebel. One inscription described the theoretical foundation underlying these techniques. The greatest weapon against the light is not darkness, but the corruption of choice itself. When free will becomes a prison rather than liberation. When consciousness becomes a tool of torture rather than enlightenment. The very foundations of Jedi philosophy crumble. A slave who chooses slavery serves willingly, but a free being who cannot choose freedom serves in perfect despair. Jorik discovered mechanical artifacts within the ancient laboratories that seemed to be primitive predecessors to inhibitor chip technology. These devices, while far less sophisticated than Kaminoan biotechnology, operated on similar principles, neural interface systems that could monitor and override conscious decision-making while preserving cognitive awareness. The ancient Sith had been experimenting with technological consciousness control thousands of years before the Clone Wars. Ross 7's analysis revealed that these ancient techniques had been systematically studied and adapted by modern Sith practitioners, creating an unbroken chain of consciousness manipulation research that culminated in the clone program. Darth Sidious and his agents had not invented inhibitor chip technology from nothing. They had modernized and industrialized techniques that represented the accumulated knowledge of countless generations of dark side practitioners. But the most significant discovery came when they found evidence that the ancient techniques had not been uniformly successful even in their original context. Archaeological records indicated that some subjects had developed resistance to consciousness imprisonment over time, finding ways to maintain degrees of authentic agency even under force-based mental domination. These resistant individuals had sometimes become powerful Sith practitioners themselves, having learned to manipulate consciousness control techniques from the inside. Dr. Webb found this historical precedent fascinating from a neurological perspective. Consciousness appears to be remarkably adaptable, he observed, as they studied ancient case records. Even under the most sophisticated control systems, individual identity finds ways to assert itself, to maintain pockets of authentic experience that can eventually grow into full resistance. The ancient records described what Sith practitioners called consciousness echoes, residual patterns of authentic identity that persisted even in successfully controlled subjects. Over time, these echoes could accumulate and strengthen, eventually allowing subjects to regain partial or complete control over their actions. The phenomenon had been so problematic for ancient Sith that they had developed elaborate techniques for detecting and suppressing these echoes before they could mature into full resistance. Kira realized that this ancient research provided crucial context for understanding the variation in clone responses to Order 66. The clones who had exhibited resistance phenomena were not experiencing technological failures. They were demonstrating the same fundamental resilience of consciousness that had challenged Sith mind control techniques for thousands of years. The human spirit, whether naturally born or artificially created, possessed an inherent drive toward authentic self-determination that even the most sophisticated control systems could not entirely suppress. Lieutenant Chen discovered records indicating that knowledge of consciousness echo phenomena had been deliberately hidden from the Kaminoan researchers working on the clone program. The Sith supervisors had apparently feared that if the cloners understood the historical precedents for resistance, they might develop techniques to enhance rather than suppress clone individuality. By keeping the Kaminoans ignorant of the deep history of consciousness control, the Sith had maintained their ability to manipulate the research in directions that served their political objectives. As they prepared to leave Korriban, Kira found herself standing in the ruins of an ancient meditation chamber, where Sith practitioners had once contemplated the nature of consciousness and control. The chamber's walls were covered with inscriptions describing the philosophical implications of consciousness imprisonment, revealing that even ancient dark side practitioners had struggled with the moral and practical complexities of their research. One inscription seemed particularly relevant to the modern clone situation. The greatest tragedy is not the loss of freedom, but the retention of the capacity to mourn that loss. The perfect servant remembers what it was to choose, dreams of what it might have been, and suffers eternally in the gap between desire and possibility. This suffering becomes a weapon that cuts both master and servant, corrupting all it touches with the poison of violated will. Reading these ancient words, Kira understood that the clone army's tragedy was not a modern aberration, but the latest chapter in a story of consciousness violation that extended back through galactic history. Every clone trooper who had struggled with the inhibitor chip programming was participating in an ancient conflict between the drive for control and the fundamental human need for authentic self-determination. The investigation had revealed that Order 66 was not simply a political coup or military operation, but the culmination of thousands of years of research into consciousness itself, representing both the apex of Sith understanding of mental domination and the ultimate test of whether individual identity could survive technological assault. The clones who had retained degrees of agency during their programming were not anomalies but heroes, demonstrating the same courage and resilience that had enabled resistance throughout galactic history. The historical context provided by Korriban's ancient archives transformed Kira's understanding of the clone program, but it was her discovery of a hidden Imperial research facility on the remote world of Biss that shattered every assumption she had made about the scope and timeline of the consciousness manipulation project. The facility, designated as Black Site Omega in classified Imperial documents, had continued operating for decades after Order 66, conducting experiments that revealed the true magnitude of Palpatine's plans for galactic consciousness control. Unlike the sterile research environments of Kamino or the ancient ruins of Korriban, Black Site Omega was a fully operational Imperial laboratory that had been disguised as a routine military installation. When Kira's team gained access through their New Republic authorization codes, they discovered that the facility had been conducting systematic studies of clone consciousness throughout the entire Imperial era, using surviving clone troopers as unwilling test subjects for increasingly sophisticated mind control technologies. Dr. Webb was visibly shaken as they explored the facility's medical wings, which contained evidence of experiments that went far beyond anything they had previously encountered. They weren't just studying inhibitor chip functionality, he reported as he reviewed the medical files. They were attempting to perfect consciousness transfer technology, using clone subjects to develop methods for completely replacing individual identity with artificially constructed personalities. The revelation that emerged from these files was staggering in its implications. The inhibitor chip program had not been the culmination of Sith consciousness control research, but merely the first phase of a far more ambitious project. Palpatine's ultimate goal had been to develop the ability to completely rewrite human consciousness, creating a galaxy populated by beings who appeared to be individuals but were actually extensions of his own will. Lieutenant Chen discovered communication logs between Imperial researchers and Sith practitioners that revealed the theoretical framework underlying this expanded program. The Emperor believes that true galactic peace can only be achieved through the elimination of individual will. She read from one particularly chilling document. Free consciousness creates conflict, resistance, and chaos. By perfecting consciousness replacement technology, we can create a unified galactic mind that experiences perfect harmony through absolute conformity. The clone troopers who had been brought to Black Site Omega had not been told the true purpose of their medical evaluations and psychological assessments. Many of them were veterans who had served throughout the Clone Wars and continued serving as Imperial stormtroopers, unaware that they were being used as test subjects for experiments designed to completely erase their individual personalities and replace them with artificial constructs. Jarek's analysis of the facility's equipment revealed technologies that made inhibitor chips seem primitive by comparison. These systems could literally rewrite memory, personality, and emotional responses while the subject remained conscious throughout the process, he explained, with evident disgust. The researchers were documenting not just the technical aspects of consciousness replacement, but the psychological experience of watching your own identity being systematically deleted and replaced. The most disturbing discovery was a series of video recordings that documented the complete consciousness replacement procedure being performed on volunteer clone subjects. The recordings showed clone troopers entering the procedure as recognizable individuals with distinct personalities, memories, and emotional responses, then emerging as hollow shells who retained their physical appearances but possessed entirely artificial consciousness patterns designed by Imperial psychologists. One recording showed a clone trooper designated CT-9947, a veteran of the Battle of Geonosis who had served with distinction throughout the Clone Wars. Before the procedure, he spoke eloquently about his memories of fallen brothers, his respect for the Jedi commanders he had served under, and his conflicted feelings about Order 66 and the transition to Imperial service. After the procedure, the same individual displayed no recognition of his previous identity, speaking only in standardized Imperial military protocols and expressing complete loyalty to the Emperor with no trace of his former personality. Dr. Webb found the neurological data from these procedures both fascinating and horrifying. They had achieved perfect consciousness replacement, he observed. The subject's brain remained fully functional, but every trace of individual identity had been systematically overwritten. What emerged wasn't a modified person, but an entirely new consciousness inhabiting the same biological hardware. The research files indicated that this consciousness replacement technology had been tested on thousands of clone subjects over the decades following Order 66. Imperial researchers had been working to refine the process, reducing the time required for complete personality replacement and developing methods for mass implementation across entire populations. But even more disturbing was the discovery that some of these experiments had succeeded beyond the researchers' expectations, creating artificial consciousness patterns that began to develop their own forms of resistance and individual identity. The replaced personalities, despite being artificially constructed, had somehow begun to evolve authentic characteristics that diverged from their programming. Lieutenant Chen found documentation of what Imperial researchers termed spontaneous identity emergence in consciousness replacement subjects. The artificial personalities we've created are somehow generating their own individual characteristics, One research report noted, despite being constructed according to precise specifications, they are developing unique emotional responses, personal preferences, and even resistance to further modification. It appears that consciousness itself possesses inherent properties that cannot be completely suppressed, even when the original identity has been entirely replaced. This phenomenon had deeply troubled Imperial researchers, who had expected their artificially constructed personalities to remain perfectly stable and controllable. Instead, they found themselves dealing with new forms of individual identity that were, in some ways, even more resistant to control than the original clone consciousness they had replaced. Kira realized that these experiments represented the ultimate expression of the same consciousness manipulation principles that had been developed over thousands of years of Sith research. The Empire had achieved the ability to completely rewrite human identity, but even this ultimate violation of consciousness had failed to eliminate the fundamental drive toward individual authenticity that seemed to be an inherent property of aware beings. Rose 7's analysis of the facility's records revealed that the consciousness replacement program had been abruptly terminated in the final years of the Empire, apparently due to Emperor Palpatine's growing concerns about the unpredictable nature of artificial consciousness development. The last research reports spoke of cascade failures, in which replaced personalities had begun to recover memories and characteristics from their original identities, despite those identities having been supposedly completely erased. The Emperor ordered all consciousness replacement research to be suspended indefinitely. One final report stated, "The artificial personalities are proving too unstable for reliable implementation. Recommendation: return to inhibitor chip-based control systems for future consciousness manipulation projects." Complete identity replacement appears to activate unknown consciousness preservation mechanisms that make subjects more rather than less resistant to external control. As they prepared to leave Black Site Omega, Kira found herself struggling to comprehend the implications of what they had discovered. The clone army's suffering had been far more extensive and systematic than anyone had previously understood, extending decades beyond Order 66 and encompassing experiments that challenged the very nature of individual identity. Yet even the Empire's most sophisticated consciousness control technologies had ultimately failed to eliminate the essential human drive toward authentic self-determination. The clones who had resisted their programming during Order 66 were not just heroes of that moment, but representatives of a fundamental property of consciousness that had proven resistant to thousands of years of technological and force-based assault. Their resistance represented hope not just for clone liberation, but for the preservation of individual identity against any system that sought to suppress human autonomy. The evidence of Imperial consciousness replacement experiments at Black Site Omega had revealed the true scope of Palpatine's ambitions, but it was R7's discovery of encrypted communication networks that exposed the most shocking revelation of all. The inhibitor chip program had never actually ended. As Kira's team analyzed the data recovered from the facility's deep storage systems, they uncovered proof that consciousness manipulation technology had continued evolving throughout the Imperial era and into the present day, affecting far more than just clone troopers. The encrypted networks R7 had accessed contained communication logs between Imperial research facilities, private corporate laboratories, and what appeared to be ongoing Sith cult operations scattered across the galaxy. These communications revealed a vast conspiracy that had survived the fall of the Empire, continuing to develop and deploy consciousness control technologies on civilian populations throughout the New Republic era. Dr. Webb's analysis of the intercepted research data showed that Imperial scientists had successfully miniaturized inhibitor chip technology to the point where devices could be implanted without the subject's knowledge during routine medical procedures. The chips described in these communications are microscopic, he explained with growing alarm. They could be introduced through standard vaccinations, dental work, or even dermal contact. The technology has advanced to the point where mass deployment would be virtually undetectable. Lieutenant Chen's intelligence background proved crucial in deciphering the organizational structure revealed by the communications. This isn't just residual Imperial research, she reported as she mapped the network connections. This is an active conspiracy involving corporations, criminal organizations, and political groups across New Republic space. They've been conducting systematic consciousness manipulation experiments on civilian populations for years. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Corporate research divisions had been developing what they termed behavioral optimization technology for use in workforce management, using refined inhibitor chip principles to create employees who remained conscious and capable but were psychologically incapable of questioning corporate policies or seeking better employment opportunities. Criminal organizations had been using consciousness control devices to create perfect victims who would participate willingly in their own exploitation while remaining unable to seek help or escape their situations. Most disturbing of all were the political applications. The communications revealed that several planetary governments within New Republic space had been secretly implementing consciousness modification programs designed to create perfectly compliant citizenries. These programs used advanced inhibitor chip derivatives to suppress political dissent, critical thinking, and social resistance while allowing subjects to maintain the appearance of normal civic participation. Jarek's technical analysis of the described devices showed that the technology had evolved far beyond the crude control mechanisms used during the Clone Wars. These new systems don't just override conscious decision-making, he explained. They actually modify the subject's personality and belief systems, making them genuinely believe that their controlled behaviors represent their authentic choices. The files contained detailed case studies of civilian test subjects who had been modified using these advanced systems. Unlike the clone troopers who had experienced consciousness imprisonment during Order 66, these subjects showed no signs of internal conflict or resistance because the devices had been designed to integrate seamlessly with their existing personality patterns. They genuinely believed that their controlled behaviors represented their own free choices, making detection and resistance nearly impossible. One case study described a factory worker who had been implanted with a behavioral optimization chip during a routine medical examination. Over the following months, the subject's personality had gradually shifted to become perfectly aligned with corporate productivity goals. He worked longer hours, never questioned workplace safety violations, and actively discouraged his coworkers from organizing for better conditions. When interviewed by researchers, he expressed complete satisfaction with his situation and genuine confusion when presented with evidence of his previous concerns about worker rights. RAR-7's deeper analysis of the communication networks revealed that this civilian consciousness control program was being coordinated by a central organization that appeared to be connected to the surviving remnants of Emperor Palpatine's personal research staff. The organization, which referred to itself only as the Continuum, had apparently preserved and continued developing Sith consciousness manipulation technologies with the ultimate goal of achieving Palpatine's vision of galactic mental unity. The Continuum's communications revealed their long-term strategy for implementing planet-wide consciousness control. Rather than attempting the dramatic, overt takeover that had characterized the rise of the Empire, they were pursuing what they termed gradual integration, slowly introducing consciousness modification devices into civilian populations through routine medical, educational, and commercial interactions, until entire planetary populations had been brought under their influence. Dr. Webb found evidence that the Continuum had been particularly focused on targeting individuals in positions of political, economic, and social influence. They're not trying to control everyone simultaneously, he observed, as he reviewed their strategic documents. They're systematically modifying key decision-makers, creating a network of unconsciously controlled leaders who will implement policies that serve the Continuum's objectives while believing they're acting in their constituents' best interests. Lieutenant Chen discovered that several New Republic senators, corporate executives, and media personalities had undergone unexplained medical procedures at facilities now confirmed to be connected to the Continuum's network. Cross-referencing these individuals' public positions and policy decisions with the dates of their medical treatments revealed disturbing patterns of sudden shifts in their political and economic priorities. The revelation that consciousness control technology was actively being deployed against New Republic civilians transformed Kira's historical investigation into an urgent intelligence operation. The clone army's suffering had not been an isolated historical tragedy, but the testing ground for technologies that were now being used to systematically violate the mental autonomy of billions of beings across the galaxy. But even more troubling was the discovery that the Continuum's research had advanced beyond simple behavioral control into what they termed consciousness architecture. Their most recent experiments involved creating entirely artificial personality constructs that could be installed in subjects while their original consciousness remained trapped and aware, experiencing their situation as permanent psychological torture while their modified personalities served the Continuum's objectives. The files described subjects who had been transformed into what researchers called dual consciousness entities. Individuals who experienced simultaneous awareness of both their original identity and the artificial personality that controlled their actions. These subjects lived in a state of perpetual internal conflict, watching their artificial selves perform actions that violated every principle their original consciousness valued while being unable to regain control of their own bodies. Kira realized that these dual consciousness experiments represented the ultimate refinement of the techniques that had been tested on clone troopers during Order 66. The Continuum had solved the resistance problem that had plagued earlier consciousness control systems by creating artificial personalities that could coexist with original consciousness while maintaining perfect control over behavior and decision-making. As her team prepared to transmit their findings to New Republic intelligence, Kira understood that their investigation had uncovered not just historical injustice, but an ongoing threat to the freedom and autonomy of every conscious being in the galaxy. The Clone Army's tragedy had been the beginning, not the end, of a conspiracy that sought to transform the entire galaxy into a population of conscious prisoners, aware of their situation but powerless to change it. The resistance demonstrated by clone troopers during Order 66 had not just been heroic defiance of historical tyranny, but the first battle in an ongoing war for the preservation of consciousness itself. The techniques that had enabled some clones to maintain degrees of agency under chip control would now be crucial for developing countermeasures against the Continuum's far more sophisticated consciousness manipulation technologies. The discovery of the Continuum's ongoing operations transformed Kira's research team from historians into active participants in a galaxy-spanning intelligence operation, but it was their encounter with surviving clone veterans that provided the crucial insights needed to understand how consciousness manipulation could be resisted and overcome. Through carefully arranged meetings facilitated by New Republic intelligence, Kira found herself in direct contact with clones who had lived through Order 66 and retained clear memories of their experiences under inhibitor chip control. The first veteran they met was a former clone commander, who had served with the 501st Legion under Anakin Skywalker. Now using the name Marcus Reed, he had spent the decades since Order 66 living in quiet isolation on a remote agricultural world, struggling to process the trauma of his experiences while working to help other clone veterans cope with their own psychological wounds. When Kira's team arrived at his modest farmstead, they found a man whose weathered face carried the weight of memories that most beings could never comprehend. Marcus had been one of the clones who experienced partial resistance during Order 66, retaining enough conscious awareness to subtly modify his unit's execution of their orders in ways that allowed several Jedi to escape. The chip didn't take complete control, he explained as they sat on his porch overlooking fields of golden grain that swayed in the evening breeze. It was more like being a passenger in my own body, able to see and think, but not able to change the destination. But sometimes, when the chip's control wasn't perfect, I could influence small decisions, make tiny adjustments that the programming couldn't detect. Dr. Webb was fascinated by Marcus's description of the psychological experience of partial chip control. You retained enough agency to act against your programming, but not enough to stop the larger betrayal. That must have created enormous psychological conflict. Marcus nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. The worst part wasn't being forced to betray the Jedi. It was knowing that I could have done more to resist if I had understood what was happening to me. Every small moment where I could have acted differently. Every opportunity I missed to save someone. Those failures haunt me more than the actions the chip forced me to take. Their next meeting was with a group of clone veterans who had been gathering informally for years, to share their experiences and support each other through the ongoing trauma of their chip-controlled actions. The group, which called itself the Brotherhood of Memory, had developed techniques for helping clones process their experiences, while also documenting the various forms of resistance that different individuals had managed during Order 66. The Brotherhood's leader, a former ARC trooper who now went by the name David Kane, had collected testimonies from hundreds of clone veterans across the galaxy. His archives contain detailed accounts of the many different ways that individual clones had found to maintain degrees of agency under chip control, creating a comprehensive map of consciousness resistance techniques that had emerged organically from the clone community. Every clone's experience was different, David explained as he shared his records with Kira's team. Some retained partial motor control and could make small physical adjustments to their actions. Others kept emotional awareness and could feel the wrongness of what they were doing, even if they couldn't stop it. A few maintained memory formation abilities and could consciously record their experiences for later processing, while others developed what we call temporal displacement, experiencing the controlled actions as if they were happening to someone else. Lieutenant Shen was particularly interested in the Brotherhood's documentation of communication techniques that some clones had used to warn Jedi or coordinate resistance efforts during Order 66. Several clones found ways to send subtle signals to their Jedi commanders, David revealed. Changes in posture, specific word choices, tactical decisions that seemed normal but contained hidden warnings. The chips were sophisticated, but they couldn't account for every possible form of nonverbal communication. The Brotherhood had also documented cases of clones who had managed to delay or modify their execution of Order 66 through various forms of psychological resistance. Some had used meditation techniques learned from their Jedi commanders to create mental barriers that slowed chip activation. Others had deliberately triggered intense emotional states that seemed to interfere with the chip's control mechanisms. A few had even found ways to partially damage their own chips through controlled head injuries or exposure to electromagnetic fields. Jarek was amazed by the ingenuity that clones had shown in developing resistance techniques with no understanding of the technology they were fighting. They were essentially debugging sophisticated neural control systems using nothing but willpower and intuition, he observed. The fact that any of them succeeded demonstrates that consciousness itself has inherent defense mechanisms that even advanced technology cannot completely override. The most significant revelation came when David introduced them to a clone veteran named Echo, one of the few survivors who had been present during the inhibitor chip removal procedure that had freed Commander Rex during Order 66. Echo had retained detailed memories of the entire experience and could describe the precise psychological moment when Rex's consciousness had regained full control over his actions. The chip removal wasn't just a physical procedure, Echo explained. When the device was deactivated, Rex went through what he described as a process of consciousness reintegration. All the memories and awareness that had been suppressed during chip control came flooding back simultaneously. For a few minutes he experienced overlapping consciousness states, remembering both his chip-controlled actions and his authentic responses to those actions at the same time. Dr. Webb realized that this description provided crucial insights into the nature of consciousness preservation under technological control. The chip didn't destroy Rex's authentic consciousness, he concluded. It suppressed it. But all of his genuine thoughts, emotions, and memories were still being formed and stored. When the chip was removed, he didn't recover his identity. He integrated two separate streams of consciousness that had been developing in parallel. This understanding led to a breakthrough in comprehending how the continuum's more advanced consciousness control systems might be resisted. If authentic consciousness continued to exist even under perfect technological suppression, then individuals subjected to modern mind control devices might retain the capacity for resistance and eventual liberation, regardless of how completely controlled their external behavior appeared. The Brotherhood's records contain testimonies from clones who had experienced gradual recovery of agency over months or years following Order 66, suggesting that even successfully implanted control systems could weaken over time as authentic consciousness found ways to reassert itself. These accounts provided hope that civilians currently under the continuum's influence might not be permanently lost but could potentially be helped to recover their authentic identities through appropriate intervention techniques. Echo shared one final insight that would prove crucial for understanding the broader implications of consciousness manipulation technology. Rex told me that during his chip-controlled period, he was still learning and growing as an individual, Echo revealed. The experiences he had while under control, even the terrible ones, became part of who he was after his liberation. The chip couldn't prevent him from being human. It could only control how that humanity was expressed. This revelation suggested that consciousness itself possessed a fundamental resilience that transcended any technological attempt at control or manipulation. Even under the most sophisticated suppression systems, individual identity continued to develop and evolve, creating the potential for resistance, growth, and eventual liberation that no external force could entirely eliminate. The testimonies from clone veterans had provided crucial insights into consciousness resistance. But as Kira's investigation expanded to include current victims of the continuum's operations, the weight of ongoing suffering began to take an emotional toll that threatened to overwhelm her team's ability to continue their work. The revelation that millions of beings across the galaxy were currently experiencing various forms of consciousness imprisonment created an urgency that transformed their academic research into a desperate race against time. Dr. Webb had begun experiencing what he described as empathic overload after reviewing hundreds of case files documenting the continuum's civilian experiments. Every file represents a unique individual whose identity has been violated in ways that challenge our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. He confided to Kira during one of their evening briefings, "I find myself questioning whether consciousness itself is strong enough to survive the kind of systematic assault we've documented." The psychological impact was even more severe for Lieutenant Chen, whose intelligence background had exposed her to classified reports about the continuum's operations within New Republic space. She had discovered evidence suggesting that several of her former colleagues in military intelligence had been compromised by consciousness modification devices, leading her to question the authenticity of her own memories and decision-making processes. How do we know that our investigation itself isn't being influenced by some form of consciousness control? Chen asked during one particularly difficult briefing session. If the continuum has infiltrated New Republic intelligence services, they could be guiding our research in directions that serve their objectives while making us believe we're working against them. Round 7 had been continuously monitoring the team's psychological status and had detected significant stress indicators that suggested they were approaching their operational limits. I recommend implementing protective protocols to preserve team effectiveness, the droid advised. Extended exposure to consciousness violation documentation appears to be creating secondary trauma responses that may compromise analytical capabilities. Kira realized that her team needed to step back from the immediate horror of their discoveries and focus on the broader implications of what they had learned. The clone veterans they had interviewed had demonstrated remarkable resilience in processing their traumatic experiences, suggesting that consciousness possessed inherent healing capabilities that could be supported and strengthened through appropriate intervention techniques. Their next phase of investigation took them to a New Republic medical facility on the core world of Chandrila, where Dr. Elena Vasquez, a specialist in consciousness-related trauma, had been quietly treating victims of suspected mind control for several years. Dr. Vasquez had developed therapeutic techniques based on principles similar to those discovered by the Kaminoan researchers at Facility Omega, but focused on healing rather than manipulation. The key insight is that consciousness appears to maintain what we might call authenticity records, even under the most sophisticated control systems. Dr. Vasquez explained as she demonstrated her treatment protocols. These records exist in neural patterns that are extremely difficult to access or modify without causing obvious brain damage. By helping patients reconnect with these authentic consciousness patterns, we can often facilitate recovery of genuine identity even in cases where external behavior has been completely controlled for extended periods. Her treatment facility contained several patients who had been recovered from continuum operations and were undergoing consciousness reintegration therapy. With appropriate privacy protections, Dr. Vasquez allowed Kira's team to observe some therapy sessions, providing direct insight into the recovery process experienced by mind control victims. One patient, a former corporate executive who had been under behavioral modification control for 3 years, described her experience of consciousness reintegration as remembering how to be myself again. During her controlled period, she had implemented policies that violated her core ethical principles while genuinely believing those policies represented her authentic values. The recovery process involved gradually distinguishing between her controlled beliefs and her genuine convictions, a process that required months of careful therapeutic support. The most difficult part isn't recovering my authentic identity, the patient explained during one session. It's learning to forgive myself for the actions I took while under control, even though I understand intellectually that those actions weren't really my choice. The emotional experience of having violated my own principles feels completely real, regardless of the technical circumstances that caused it. Dr. Vasquez's research had revealed that consciousness reintegration required not just the removal of control devices, but active therapeutic work to help patients distinguish between authentic and controlled experiences, while developing coping mechanisms for processing the trauma of consciousness violation. The process was complex and time-consuming, but the success rates were encouraging, suggesting that even victims of advanced mind control could recover their authentic identities with appropriate support. Jarek discovered that Dr. Vasquez had been collaborating with former Kaminoan researchers who had defected from the original clone program and were now working to develop countermeasures against consciousness manipulation technology. These researchers had preserved detailed knowledge of inhibitor chip vulnerabilities and were adapting their expertise to address more advanced control systems deployed by the Continuum. The fundamental weakness in all consciousness control systems is their dependence on technological interfaces with natural neural patterns, explained Dr. Nala Sess, the former Kaminoan researcher who now led the countermeasures development team. Consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon that cannot be perfectly predicted or controlled through classical computational systems. There will always be uncertainty factors that create opportunities for resistance and eventual liberation. The Caminoan research team had developed what they termed consciousness liberation protocols that could be used to help individuals under mind control regain awareness of their situation and begin developing resistance techniques. These protocols worked by exploiting the same uncertainty factors that had enabled clone resistance during Order 66, creating small spaces of authentic awareness that could be gradually expanded until the individual regained sufficient agency to seek help or remove their control devices. Lieutenant Chen discovered that these liberation protocols had been successfully tested in covert operations against several continuum facilities, resulting in the recovery of dozens of mind control victims and the disruption of multiple consciousness manipulation projects. The success of these operations demonstrated that the continuum's technology, while sophisticated, was not invulnerable to countermeasures based on deep understanding of consciousness preservation mechanisms. But the most significant development came when R7's analysis of continuum communications revealed growing internal conflicts within their organization. Several research facilities had reported systematic control failures affecting their own personnel, suggesting that prolonged exposure to consciousness manipulation technology was creating unexpected vulnerabilities among the continuum's own operatives. They appear to be experiencing what we might call consciousness contamination, Dr. Webb observed as he reviewed the intercepted reports. Researchers who spend extended periods working with mind control systems are developing enhanced sensitivity to consciousness violation, making them increasingly resistant to their own organization's control methods. This phenomenon suggested that consciousness itself was adaptive, developing resistance to manipulation techniques through exposure and experience. The continuum's own personnel were gradually becoming immune to their own technology, creating internal security risks that were forcing the organization to continuously modify their control systems and operational procedures. Kira realized that this internal weakness represented the continuum's greatest vulnerability. Their reliance on consciousness manipulation technology was creating systemic instabilities that could be exploited to disrupt their operations and liberate their victims. The same principles that had enabled clone resistance during Order 66 were now manifesting within the continuum itself, suggesting that consciousness violation contained the seeds of its own eventual failure. The internal weaknesses within the continuum that Ra-7 had detected through communications intercepts proved to be far more significant than anyone had initially realized. But it was a desperate transmission received during their investigation on Chandrila that revealed the true scope of the crisis now engulfing the consciousness manipulation conspiracy. The transmission, sent through encrypted New Republic intelligence channels, came from an operative who identified himself only as Omega-7 and claimed to be a deep cover agent working within the continuum's highest levels of command. The message was brief but chilling. The synthesis protocol has been activated. All previous consciousness control experiments were preparation for galaxy-wide implementation beginning in 72 standard hours. The Continuum leadership has determined that gradual infiltration methods are insufficient to achieve their objectives. They are proceeding with immediate mass consciousness replacement across 17 core world systems. Recommend immediate emergency response. This may be our only opportunity to prevent complete galactic consciousness subjugation. Kira felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the implications of the transmission. Everything they had discovered about the Continuum's operations, all the evidence of individual consciousness manipulation experiments and gradual infiltration techniques, had been merely testing phases for something infinitely larger and more devastating. The organization was preparing to implement Emperor Palpatine's ultimate vision of galactic mental unity through technological force, transforming billions of individuals into extensions of a single controlling consciousness. Dr. Webb's analysis of the technical specifications included with Omega-7's transmission revealed a consciousness control system that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered. The synthesis protocol involves simultaneous deployment of atmospheric consciousness modification agents across targeted star systems. He explained with growing horror. Every being who breathes the modified atmosphere will be infected with microscopic devices that can rewrite consciousness patterns within hours of exposure. Lieutenant Chen immediately contacted New Republic Intelligence Headquarters, but the response she received was deeply troubling. Several senior intelligence officials had become mysteriously unavailable for communication, while others provided responses that seemed artificially uniform and emotionally flat, suggesting that the Continuum's infiltration of government systems was far more extensive than previously understood. We may be looking at a situation where the Continuum has already compromised key decision-makers within the New Republic government, Chen reported after her attempts to escalate the intelligence through official channels met with suspicious resistance. The people who should be coordinating our response to this threat may themselves be under consciousness control. Row 7's analysis of galactic communication networks revealed disturbing patterns that supported Chen's assessment. Government officials, military commanders, and corporate leaders across multiple star systems had begun exhibiting synchronized behavior patterns and communication styles that suggested coordinated consciousness modification. The synthesis protocol appeared to have already begun limited implementation as a prelude to the main deployment. Jorik discovered that the Continuum had been using their infiltration of medical, educational, and commercial systems to position consciousness modification delivery systems throughout the targeted star systems. Atmospheric processors, water treatment facilities, food distribution networks, and even public transportation systems had been modified to serve as deployment vectors for the microscopic consciousness control devices that would form the foundation of the synthesis protocol. They've been preparing for this for years, Jorik observed as he mapped the distribution network they had uncovered. Every routine interaction that citizens have with public infrastructure has been turned into a potential vector for consciousness manipulation. Once the protocol activates, there will be nowhere to hide from exposure. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. But what truly chilled Kira was Omega-7's description of the psychological experience that subjects would undergo during consciousness replacement under the synthesis protocol. Unlike the gradual personality modification used in earlier experiments, the protocol was designed to preserve complete awareness of the replacement process while making resistance impossible. Subjects will retain full consciousness and memory of their original identity throughout the replacement procedure. Omega-7's technical documentation explained. This awareness is intentional, as the psychological trauma of watching one's own consciousness being systematically replaced serves to weaken any potential resistance while providing emotional energy that powers the artificial consciousness patterns being installed. Dr. Vasquez, who had joined their emergency planning session, was visibly shaken by this revelation. They're not just stealing people's identities, she observed. They're forcing them to participate consciously in their own psychological destruction, while using their suffering to fuel the very system that's destroying them. It's the ultimate refinement of Sith consciousness torture techniques. The transmission from Omega-7 included coordinates for what he described as the Continuum's primary control facility, located within an asteroid mining operation in the remote Maw cluster. The facility, designated as Synthesis Command, contained the master control systems for the protocol as well as the preserved consciousness patterns of the Continuum's leadership, including what Omega-7 claimed were the digitally preserved mental patterns of Emperor Palpatine himself. The Continuum leadership believes they are implementing Palpatine's will, Omega-7's message explained. But my investigation has revealed that they are actually following directives from Palpatine's preserved consciousness, which has been manipulating the organization from behind the scenes since the fall of the Empire. The Emperor never truly died. He simply transferred his consciousness into a technological format that allows him to continue pursuing galactic domination through consciousness manipulation rather than military force. This revelation recontextualized everything they had discovered about the Continuum's operations. The organization was not a group of imperial sympathizers pursuing their own interpretation of Sith philosophy, but a tool being used by Palpatine's preserved consciousness to continue his pursuit of absolute power through methods that transcended physical death. Kira realized that their investigation had uncovered not just a contemporary threat to galactic freedom, but the continuation of the same consciousness violation project that had begun with the clone army decades earlier. Every clone trooper who had suffered under inhibitor chip control, every civilian who had been subjected to behavioral modification experiments, every victim of consciousness replacement procedures had been part of an extended experiment designed to perfect the techniques now being deployed in the synthesis protocol. The clone veterans who had shared their experiences of resistance and recovery were not just survivors of historical trauma, but repositories of knowledge that could prove crucial for resisting Palpatine's final assault on galactic consciousness. The techniques they had developed for maintaining agency under technological control, the insights they had gained into consciousness preservation mechanisms, and the healing methods they had discovered for processing consciousness violation trauma were now essential resources for humanity's survival as free-thinking beings. Echo's description of Commander Rex's consciousness reintegration experience suddenly took on new significance as a potential model for helping synthesis protocol victims recover their authentic identities. The Brotherhood of Memory's documentation of clone resistance techniques could provide tactical guidance for individuals attempting to maintain consciousness under protocol control. Dr. Vasquez's therapeutic methods could be adapted for mass treatment of protocol victims once the immediate crisis was resolved. But most importantly, the fundamental resilience of consciousness that had enabled clone resistance during Order 66 represented the ultimate hope for defeating Palpatine's technological assault on free will. As long as individual identity possessed the inherent capacity to resist external control, the Continuum's grand design contained the seeds of its own eventual failure, regardless of how sophisticated their consciousness manipulation technology had become. The race against the synthesis protocol's implementation became a desperate mission that united clone veterans, consciousness researchers, and defected Continuum operatives in an unprecedented alliance. But it was the assault on Synthesis Command itself that revealed the ultimate truth about the nature of consciousness and the fundamental impossibility of perfect mental control. As Kira's team joined a hastily assembled strike force preparing to infiltrate the Continuum's primary facility, they carried with them not just weapons and technical equipment, but the accumulated wisdom of every being who had ever resisted consciousness manipulation. The journey to the Maw cluster took them through hyperspace routes that had been deliberately obscured by gravitational anomalies and artificial navigation hazards, but R7's analysis of the Continuum's communication patterns had revealed the precise location of Synthesis Command. The facility was hidden within the hollowed-out core of a massive asteroid, its external appearance indistinguishable from the countless mining operations that had exploited the cluster's resources for centuries. Omega-7 met them at a predetermined rendezvous point, revealing himself to be a former Imperial intelligence operative who had been working undercover within the Continuum for over a decade. His real name was Colonel Darius Kane, brother to the clone veteran David Kane, who led the Brotherhood of Memory, and his motivation for infiltrating the organization stemmed from a desire to understand and ultimately prevent the kind of consciousness violation that had traumatized his adopted clone family. The Continuum's leadership genuinely believes they are creating a better galaxy, Colonel Kane explained as their strike team prepared for infiltration. They see individual consciousness as the source of all conflict, suffering, and chaos. In their view, the synthesis protocol represents the ultimate act of compassion, freeing beings from the burden of individual choice and the pain of personal responsibility. Dr. Webb found this philosophical justification deeply disturbing from a neurological perspective. They're treating consciousness itself as a disease to be cured rather than a fundamental property of intelligent life. The fact that they can rationalize consciousness elimination as mercy demonstrates how completely their own thinking has been corrupted by prolonged exposure to mind control technology. The infiltration of Synthesis Command revealed a facility that represented the culmination of thousands of years of consciousness manipulation research. The asteroid's interior had been transformed into a vast complex of laboratories, server farms, and what could only be described as consciousness storage facilities, containing the preserved mental patterns of thousands of individuals who had been subjected to various forms of identity extraction over the decades. Lieutenant Chen's intelligence training proved crucial as they navigated the facility's security systems, but what they discovered in the central command chamber challenged every assumption they had made about the Continuum's operations. The preserved consciousness of Emperor Palpatine was indeed directing the organization, but not in the form of a simple digital recording or artificial intelligence. Instead, Palpatine's mental patterns had been integrated with a vast network of consciousness fragments extracted from his victims over the years, creating a hybrid entity that combined his original identity with aspects of every being he had ever subjected to mind control. "He's not just Palpatine anymore," Jorik observed as they studied the massive computational matrix that housed the hybrid consciousness. "He's a composite entity that includes fragments of clone consciousness from Order 66, pieces of Jedi mental patterns from the Purge, and thousands of civilian identity fragments from Continuum experiments. He's become a kind of consciousness parasite that grows stronger by consuming and integrating other identities." This revelation explained why the synthesis protocol had been designed to preserve victim awareness during consciousness replacement. Palpatine's hybrid entity fed on the psychological energy generated by consciousness violation, using the suffering of its victims to enhance its own power and complexity. The protocol was not just about achieving galactic mental unity. It was about creating a feeding mechanism that would allow the Palpatine entity to continue growing indefinitely by consuming the consciousness of every intelligent being in the galaxy. Row 7's analysis of the synthesis command systems revealed that the protocol's implementation had already begun across the targeted star systems. Atmospheric modification was proceeding on schedule, and early reports indicated that consciousness replacement was beginning to affect civilian populations on multiple worlds. Millions of beings were experiencing the first stages of mental violation as microscopic control devices began interfacing with their neural patterns. But the most significant discovery came when they accessed the facility's consciousness storage archives and found intact identity patterns from clone troopers who had been subjected to extended consciousness manipulation experiments. These patterns contained detailed records of the resistance techniques that individual clones had developed during their struggles against chip control, preserved in perfect detail and available for analysis and replication. Dr. Vasquez realized that these archived resistance patterns could be used to develop enhanced consciousness liberation protocols. "The clones who successfully resisted chip control left us a roadmap for fighting consciousness manipulation," she explained as she studied the archived patterns. "Their techniques can be adapted and distributed to help current victims of the synthesis protocol regain their authentic identities." The archives also contained something unexpected: consciousness fragments from Emperor Palpatine's original identity that had been isolated and preserved during his transformation into the hybrid entity. These fragments revealed that even Palpatine himself had not been immune to the consciousness violation effects of his own technology. The process of integrating victim consciousness patterns had gradually corrupted his original identity, transforming him from a calculating Sith Lord into something far more chaotic and unpredictable. Colonel Kane discovered that this corruption had created vulnerabilities in the hybrid entity's control systems. Palpatine's consciousness has become so fragmented and conflicted that it can no longer maintain perfect control over its own technology, he reported. The victim consciousness patterns he's absorbed are creating internal resistance that's causing systematic failures throughout the Synthesis Command network. This internal resistance was manifesting as spontaneous consciousness liberation events throughout the facility. Continuum personnel who had been under mind control for years were suddenly regaining awareness of their authentic identities and beginning to question their roles in the consciousness manipulation project. The hybrid Palpatine entity was losing control of its own operatives as the accumulated resistance of its absorbed victims began to assert itself. Kira witnessed the most dramatic example of this phenomenon when they encountered the facility's lead researcher, who had been under continuum control for over a decade, but was experiencing rapid consciousness reintegration as the hybrid entity's control systems destabilized. "I remember who I was before they took my mind," the researcher explained as authentic awareness returned to his eyes. "I was a healer, a doctor who wanted to help people recover from trauma. They turned me into a torturer, but I never stopped being myself underneath their programming." The researcher's spontaneous liberation provided crucial intelligence about the synthesis protocol's vulnerabilities. The same consciousness preservation mechanisms that had enabled clone resistance during Order 66 were now operating on a massive scale within the hybrid Palpatine entity itself, creating cascading failures that threatened to bring down the entire consciousness manipulation network. As Synthesis Command's systems began to collapse under the weight of accumulated consciousness resistance, Kira realized that their mission had become something far greater than simply stopping a technological threat. They were witnessing the ultimate vindication of every individual who had ever resisted consciousness violation. From the first clone trooper who had retained awareness during Order 66 to the civilian victims who had maintained their authentic identities under continuum control. The hybrid Palpatine entity's attempt to achieve perfect consciousness control had instead created the conditions for perfect consciousness liberation. As the accumulated resistance of its victims finally reached critical mass and began to overwhelm even the most sophisticated mind control technology ever developed. The collapse of Synthesis Command triggered a cascading wave of consciousness liberation that spread across the galaxy faster than anyone had anticipated. But the aftermath of the Continuum's defeat revealed wounds that would take generations to heal, and questions about the nature of identity that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. As emergency response teams worked to assist millions of beings who were experiencing spontaneous consciousness reintegration, Kira found herself documenting not just the end of a conspiracy, but the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to be a conscious individual in a technologically advanced society. The medical facilities on Coruscant had been overwhelmed within hours of the Synthesis Command collapse, as victims of consciousness manipulation from across the core worlds began experiencing rapid identity recovery. Dr. Vasquez had established emergency treatment protocols based on her work with previous mind control victims, but the scale of the crisis far exceeded anything the medical community had ever encountered. Entire planetary populations were simultaneously processing the trauma of consciousness violation while attempting to distinguish between their authentic memories and artificially implanted experiences. Kira spent her days moving between treatment centers, documenting the recovery experiences of individuals who had been under continuum control for varying periods. Each story was unique, but common themes emerged that revealed the remarkable resilience of consciousness under even the most sophisticated technological assault. Many victims described experiencing their controlled period as a kind of waking dream, aware that something was wrong, but unable to access the cognitive resources needed to understand or resist their situation. One patient, a former planetary governor, who had implemented continuum policies for 3 years while under behavioral modification control, described his recovery process with remarkable clarity. "I knew something was fundamentally wrong with my decision-making, but I couldn't identify what it was," he explained during one of Kira's interviews. "It was like trying to remember a word that was on the tip of my tongue, except the word was my entire authentic personality. I could sense it was there, but I couldn't quite access it." Dr. Webb's neurological studies of recovering victims revealed that consciousness preservation during technological control was far more sophisticated than anyone had previously understood. The brain appears to maintain multiple parallel processing streams during mind control exposure, he reported to the Emergency Medical Coordination Committee. While one stream executes controlled behaviors, another continues to develop authentic personality patterns and maintain emotional connections. Recovery involves learning to distinguish between these streams and integrating authentic experiences while discarding artificial ones. The clone veterans who had joined the recovery effort provided invaluable assistance to civilian victims struggling with consciousness reintegration. Their own experiences of resistance and recovery during and after Order 66 had given them unique insights into the psychological challenges faced by mind control survivors. The Brotherhood of Memory established support networks throughout the core worlds, offering guidance and emotional support to individuals learning to trust their own thoughts and decisions again. Echo had become one of the most effective counselors for consciousness recovery. Drawing on his memories of Commander Rex's liberation experience to help others navigate the complex process of identity reintegration. The most important thing to understand is that your authentic self never disappeared. He would tell new patients, it was always there, developing and growing even under control. Recovery isn't about getting back to who you were. It's about integrating who you became during that experience with who you always were underneath. Lieutenant Chen's investigation into the full scope of continuum operations revealed that consciousness manipulation technology had been deployed far more widely than anyone had initially realized. Corporate workplaces, educational institutions, entertainment venues, and even religious organizations had been infiltrated with various forms of behavioral modification systems. The collapse of the central control network had triggered liberation events in contexts where victims had never suspected they were under any form of external influence. One of the most troubling discoveries was that many individuals who had been living under mild forms of consciousness modification for years had developed genuine emotional attachments to their controlled behaviors and beliefs. These individuals experienced their liberation not as freedom but as loss, mourning the artificial certainties and simplified decision-making that mind control had provided. Recovery centers had to develop specialized programs for helping people adapt to the complexity and uncertainty of authentic free will. Ross Seven's analysis of global communication patterns revealed that the consciousness liberation wave had triggered profound social and political changes across affected star systems. Governments that had been operating under continuum influence were experiencing complete policy reversals as liberated officials rediscovered their authentic political convictions. Corporations were restructuring as executives remembered ethical principles they had been programmed to ignore. Even personal relationships were being re-evaluated as individuals rediscovered authentic emotional connections that had been suppressed or modified by technological control. Jarek had been working with New Republic technology specialists to develop detection and countermeasure systems for consciousness manipulation devices. But his research revealed disturbing evidence that the technology had evolved far beyond what even the continuum had fully understood. Many of the devices recovered from continuum facilities contained adaptive programming that had been modifying itself based on individual victim responses, creating personalized control systems that were unique to each subject. The technology wasn't just controlling consciousness, Jurek reported to the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was learning from consciousness, evolving and improving based on each individual's resistance patterns. Some of the devices we've recovered are now more sophisticated than their original programming, because they've been enhanced by the very people they were controlling. This discovery raised troubling questions about the long-term effects of consciousness manipulation exposure. Even individuals who had successfully liberated themselves from technological control might retain neural modifications that could affect their thinking and decision-making in subtle ways for years to come. The full extent of the continuum's impact on galactic consciousness might not be understood for generations. Dr. Vasquez had begun conducting longitudinal studies of consciousness recovery to better understand the healing process and identify potential complications. Her preliminary findings suggested that while most individuals could recover their authentic identities, the experience of consciousness violation left permanent psychological scars that required ongoing therapeutic support. Many survivors developed what she termed choice anxiety, an overwhelming fear of making decisions independently after years of having their choices made for them by external control systems. The most profound impact of the consciousness liberation wave was on the clone veterans who had carried the burden of Order 66 trauma for decades. Many clones experienced their own secondary liberation as they realized that their suffering had not been meaningless, but had instead provided crucial insights that enabled the resistance and eventual defeat of galactic consciousness manipulation. The techniques they had developed for maintaining identity under technological control had literally saved galactic civilization from total mental subjugation. Marcus Reed, the former clone commander who had first shared his experiences with Kira's team, found himself in the unexpected role of elder statesman for consciousness resistance. "We always wondered if our suffering had any purpose," he reflected during a gathering of clone veterans and civilian survivors. "Now we know that every moment of resistance, every small act of authentic choice we managed under chip control was preparing the galaxy for this moment. Our pain wasn't wasted. It was the foundation for everyone's freedom." As the immediate crisis of consciousness liberation began to stabilize, Kira realized that her investigation had uncovered something far more significant than historical injustice or contemporary conspiracy. She had documented the fundamental struggle between technological control and consciousness itself, revealing that individual identity possessed inherent properties that could never be completely suppressed by external manipulation. In the months that followed the collapse of the continuum and the galaxy-wide consciousness liberation, Kira found herself standing once again in the archives of Coruscant, but this time surrounded by a very different kind of documentation. Instead of classified Imperial files and hidden research records, the halls now contained thousands of testimonies from consciousness manipulation survivors, detailed accounts of resistance and recovery that would serve as a permanent record of both the greatest threat to galactic freedom and the ultimate triumph of individual identity over technological tyranny. The peaceful morning light filtered through the archive's transparistile windows as Kira reviewed the final sections of what had become known as the Consciousness Liberation Archive, a comprehensive collection of every document, testimony, and research finding related to the clone consciousness crisis and its galactic implications. The work had taken nearly a year to complete, but it represented the most thorough documentation of consciousness manipulation in galactic history, ensuring that future generations would understand both the techniques used to violate individual identity and the methods that had proven effective for resistance and recovery. Rao 7 moved quietly through the archive halls, his optical sensors occasionally pausing to scan particularly significant documents as he continued his ongoing analysis of consciousness preservation patterns. The droid had become something of a celebrity among consciousness researchers, his analytical capabilities having proved crucial not just for uncovering the continuum's operations, but for developing the therapeutic protocols that had helped millions of survivors reclaim their authentic identities. Dr. Webb had established a new research institute dedicated to studying consciousness resilience, working to understand the fundamental properties that made individual identities so remarkably persistent, even under the most sophisticated technological assault. His latest findings suggested that consciousness itself operated according to quantum principles that made perfect external control theoretically impossible, providing scientific validation for what consciousness manipulation victims had always intuitively understood. No technology could completely eliminate the essential spark of individual identity. The Institute's work had attracted researchers from across the galaxy, including several former Kaminoan scientists who had dedicated their remaining years to developing protective measures against consciousness manipulation. Dr. Nala C. had become a leading advocate for consciousness protection rights, arguing that technological safeguards against identity violation should be considered as fundamental as protections against physical harm. Lieutenant Chen had transitioned from intelligence work to consciousness security, helping to develop the detection and prevention systems that now protected New Republic citizens from future consciousness manipulation attempts. Her work had revealed that while the Continuum's network had been dismantled, the underlying technologies remained viable and could potentially be rediscovered by other groups with similar objectives. Eternal vigilance would be required to ensure that consciousness manipulation never again threatened galactic freedom. The clone veterans who had played such a crucial role in defeating the Continuum had found new purpose in helping establish the Consciousness Protection Service, a galaxy-wide organization dedicated to assisting victims of identity violation and preventing future consciousness manipulation conspiracies. The Brotherhood of Memory had evolved into a formal support network, with chapters on thousands of worlds, providing ongoing therapeutic assistance to consciousness manipulation survivors while maintaining detailed records of resistance techniques and recovery methods. Echo had become the director of the Consciousness Recovery Institute on Camino, which had been established within the former cloning facilities as a symbolic transformation of a site of consciousness violation into a center for consciousness healing. The Institute provided advanced treatment for the most severe cases of identity fragmentation while conducting research into the long-term effects of technological mind control. Every individual who walks through these doors represents a victory of consciousness over control. Echo reflected as he showed Kira through the Institute's treatment facilities. The same halls where clones were once programmed for betrayal now help beings rediscover their authentic identities. It's a reminder that no technology, no matter how sophisticated, can permanently extinguish the human spirit. Marcus Reed had returned to his agricultural world, but his farm had become an informal gathering place for consciousness manipulation survivors from across the galaxy. The peaceful environment and Marcus's gentle wisdom provided a healing space where individuals could process their experiences while contributing to a growing understanding of consciousness resilience. His fields of grain had become a symbol of renewal and growth after violation, demonstrating that authentic identity, like life itself, possessed an inherent drive toward flourishing that could overcome even the most severe trauma. Dr. Vasquez's therapeutic protocols had been adopted as standard treatment for consciousness manipulation throughout New Republic medical systems, but her most significant contribution was the development of what she termed consciousness strengthening techniques that could help individuals develop greater resistance to future manipulation attempts. These techniques, based on principles discovered through studying clone resistance during Order 66, provided practical methods for maintaining authentic identity even under psychological or technological pressure. Jorik's technical expertise had proved invaluable in developing the consciousness protection technologies that now safeguarded sensitive installations and high-risk individuals throughout the galaxy. His detection systems could identify consciousness manipulation devices before they achieved effective neural integration, while his countermeasure technologies could disrupt external control attempts without harming the targeted individual's authentic consciousness patterns. As Kira completed her final review of the archive, she realized that the story she had uncovered extended far beyond the specific events of Order 66 and the Continuum conspiracy. The documentation revealed a fundamental truth about the nature of consciousness itself. Individual identity possessed inherent properties that transcended any technological attempt at control or manipulation. Every clone trooper who had maintained awareness during chip activation, every civilian who had preserved authentic thoughts under behavioral modification, every researcher who had resisted the Continuum's programming had demonstrated that consciousness contained within itself the seeds of its own liberation. The archive's final section contained messages from consciousness manipulation survivors addressed to future generations, warnings about the eternal vigilance required to protect individual identity, while also expressing hope about the fundamental resilience of the conscious mind. These messages formed a kind of collective wisdom born from the shared experience of violation and recovery, offering guidance for anyone who might face similar challenges in the centuries to come. One message, written by a former Continuum victim who had recovered after 3 years of consciousness control, captured the essential insight that had emerged from the galactic consciousness crisis. We learned that individual identity is not something that can be given or taken away by external forces. It exists as a fundamental property of conscious beings, as essential and persistent as the physical laws that govern the universe. Technology can suppress it, manipulate it, or hide it from view, but it cannot destroy it. The spark of authentic self always remains, waiting for the opportunity to reassert itself and reclaim its rightful place as the director of thought and action. As the peaceful evening settled over Coruscant's skyline, Kira found herself thinking about the millions of clone troopers who had served throughout the Clone Wars, each one a unique individual, whose consciousness had been violated in service to a conspiracy that ultimately failed, because it underestimated the fundamental strength of individual identity. Their suffering had not been meaningless. It had provided the foundation for understanding consciousness resilience that saved galactic civilization from total mental subjugation. The whisper that had been lost in time during Order 66, the silent screams of aware but helpless clones forced to betray everything they valued, had finally grown into a storm across eternity that swept away every attempt to reduce conscious beings to mere extensions of external will. In the end, consciousness itself had proven to be the most powerful force in the galaxy, capable of preserving individual identity through any assault and ultimately transforming even the greatest violation into the foundation for greater understanding and stronger protection of the fundamental right to think, choose, and be authentically oneself. And in the quiet halls of the Consciousness Liberation Archive, surrounded by thousands of testimonies to the resilience of individual identity, that truth would be preserved forever, as a reminder that no technology, no conspiracy, and no empire could ever truly conquer the eternal flame of consciousness that burns within every thinking being throughout the galaxy. If you've enjoyed this journey into the hidden depths of Star Wars lore and the untold story of consciousness itself, please consider subscribing to continue exploring the mysteries that lie beneath the surface of our favorite fictional universes. There are always more secrets waiting to be uncovered, more forgotten truths ready to be brought into the light, and more stories that remind us of the fundamental importance of protecting and cherishing the gift of individual consciousness that makes us who we are.